in what is always a struggle for advantage and opportunity, you know, among local groups. This goes way back into the 19th century. People, you know, I mean, the Somalis, like everyone else, like local politicians everywhere, want an advantage. But what can foreigners do to really make their presence genuinely beneficial, you know, to the larger population? And that's why I think we've got to think more in terms of, instead of picking favorites or seeming to pick favorites, to think more about educational interventions. Everybody wants education in Somalia, no matter what you do. You can support even, you know, Quranic schools if you want. Even if you're Western, you can support Quranic schools because everyone values that. And people say, these folks care about education. We care about education too. You can respond to drought. You know, we've got a drought situation in Somalia too now that no one's paying much attention to, and that's something that almost all Somalis can say, yes, we would like we would like some relief from drought. There are lots of things that can be done. The Somali business community, we can talk about that later, has been doing a lot of business even as, you know, factions in the Horn are fighting each other. Maybe there's ways in which one can support, you know, businesses. Anyway, there are lots of possibilities that might seem and appear really much more neutral than focusing so much on formulas for trying to find who's going to share power. Because the way Somali political culture operates, I think it's fair to say this to my Somali friends, is that it's always assumed that when somebody gets an edge, then they're going to have a long-term advantage. If it's their idea, if it's proposed by that clan's leader or that clan's spokesman, then it can't be a good idea because it's obviously to their advantage. If the same idea is proposed by our side, it's a good idea, right? Because we must have, and so the ideas themselves, the mechanisms for peacemaking, the solutions for certain problems, whether they're educational or infrastructure or health problems, the solutions are always thought about in terms of who's proposing them. If those guys propose it, it must be to their political advantage. We have to find ways, challenge ourselves as both policymakers and members of the diaspora, to find ways that we can sort of, it's hard to overcome. This is a historical, you know, the history of politics in the Horn of Africa over the last 100 years. It illustrates over and over again, even as things change. There's more media now, there are more guns, there's a lot of new things that weren't there in the first Civil War, at the beginning of the 20th century, that are present in the last Civil War, you know, the war at the end of the 20th century and now running into the 21st century. But some of the logic, the way in which local politics works and people think are still really very much with us. And you know, I'm not sure there's a solution really. And I'm not sure it can be really imposed or even presented from outside. And we'll talk about that later if we have time. The second important thing that I've learned from studying Somali history for a long time, and we wrote about this in a book that I co-edited with Catherine Vesterman called The Struggle for Land in Southern Somalia. Some of you may know that. It's much more of a contemporary study of what happened, what's behind, it's called The War Behind the War is the subtitle. And in that, we argued that below the level of the various clan conflicts and the personality conflicts that one reads about in the media, there's a very real, and has been a very real, scramble for natural resources in Somalia. It didn't start with Siad. It didn't start, you know, in 1991. It started with Siad Barre. It started even before that, but it is extremely important part of the motivation, I think, of local actors. Most Somalis know this, but we don't talk about it very much. And certainly, when we talk about politics, we're saying, well, what side are those guys? Moderate or militants? Are they with this or that leader? You know, and no one's really looking at the underlying rationale. Why is it that people are fighting for Mogadishu, right? It was peaceful for 6 or 8 months, relatively peaceful. Now it's at a war again. Why do people want to destroy? Well, people want the assets. You know, they want the property, the real estate that's there, the access to the ports. They want close access to the rich farmland, you know, of the Shabelle Valley area. Maybe there's natural gas, we know there. There may be oil, you know, in Ogaden and elsewhere. So beneath all of this posturing and political discussion, I think there's a really long-standing quest to make sure that you and your cronies, if you're a clan leader or a warlord, have access to these natural resources. Siad Barre, you know, if you look at the history of the last, almost 50 years now since independence, you'll see that there's a growing, demographic movement of people from rural areas into the urban areas, and from the central regions into the southern areas. And these areas along the river, Shebeli River, we don't have a map there anymore, Shebeli and Gila rivers, are not only sources of commercial crops, bananas, of course, have been an important export. They're also places where you can get charcoal, fuel wood, timber, wood resources. And of course, they're important for livestock production, right? So it seems to me that when Siad Barre's regime passed this famous Land Registration Act in 1975, which supposedly was intended to, for the state to take over all land and be able to issue land tenure, land, what do you call it? Land, ownership.
Titles.
Yeah, thank you, right, for the land. That this was partly about his efforts to get control of some of those very valuable, if not valuable at the moment, future valuable assets along the river areas, which would give to his cronies and to his allies, thereby strengthen his own power. Lots of money was coming into the Horn of Africa in the 70s, the mid-70s, because of the oil boom, in the Middle East. People had money to invest. You could see if you were in Mogadishu and outside of it, people were building these foundations of houses. Eventually, they ended up renting all these properties, right, to journalists and security people and Operation Restore Hope and so on. So all of this real estate boom, Siad Barre saw this, and he said, this is what I want to get control of. Why do you think he banned khat? You know what khat is in Iraq? Chewing it grows in Kenya and grows in Ethiopia. In 1983 and 84, Siad Barre's government said, we have to stop this. He had a very good reason. He said, by importing this khat, Somalis are wasting their household income. We're losing foreign exchange. People are not working. They're just chewing all the time, and talking about them. The problem is even in the diaspora we can find it. But in fact, what he did was simply transfer that trade from the clans that were working it from Kenya into his own, the pockets of his own allies. So I'll finish up here. What I'm saying is that Siad Barre recognized that in terms of trade, control of livestock trade, of the Mirat trade, of the land resources, of the ports, of the new airstrips that were being built, this was absolutely critical. And what's happened with the collapse of the Somali state in 1991 is a scramble for those assets that Siad Barre and his allies had managed to begin to accumulate. That's part of the big struggle. So while we're looking in the newspapers at,